Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for all being coming here. Or assalamu alaikum to online viewers as well. Acha, the topic that I am going to discuss now is also Quran and modernity, and I am not very good at this, so I'll just try to wrap up my thoughts very precisely and accurately what I think, what my views are about modernity and Quran and how they relate with each other. I read about this phenomena like a couple of years back, but I didn't read anything recently about it. Having listened to talks of Mr. Rizwan Zamir and Fawad Naeem, gave me some insights and some new ideas and dimensions onto which I could explore this topic. So starting with the topic, I'll just briefly narrate the outline that I'm going to follow. Basically, mera jo idea hai about this topic, it follows, people usually start from colonialism, that how colonial enterprise actually pushed the enlightenment into the rest of the world from Europe, Western Europe. My presentation, my views would start from how did colonialism came to pass. How did actually this enlightenment took place? What were the reasons that enlightenment actually started in Western Europe after a long time? Like we all know that the building blocks of modern Western civilization were the Greeks and the Roman civilizations. So Romans or Greeks philosophies thi, which actually pushed the enlightenment and Renaissance and all this modern philosophical concept that we see in most modern Western civilization. तो ये किस तरह push किस तरह हुई? What were the reasons they, after a lag of like 1500 years, 1000 years, Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy at an instance became relevant? So starting off, the first factor actually which surprised most people, Muslims were the reasons that all of these Greek and Roman philosophies became relevant and actually made Renaissance and Enlightenment possible. How come? The first factor was the Crusades. So what happened actually with the Crusades was that when Crusades started in 1097, when Jerusalem was taken over by the Christians, so there were an influx of ideas and information, material wealth that transcended, that started flowing from the Muslim world towards the Western European world. Like Europeans were actually amazed by the quality of good life that the Muslims were having, and they were completely blown away कि ज़िंदगी इस तरह भी गुजारी जाती है. So much material wealth, so much fascination with the idea, so much intellect was happening in Muslim world कि Europeans were actually, Crusaders were actually simply blown away. So this was one of the factors, let me mark this as number one, which actually inspired the European mind to struggle for something more, intellectually, economically, politically and socially. Another key factor was the Muslim Spain. And I'm going to tell you how Muslim Spain was another key factor. Basically, we all know that when Muslims conquered Spain in 712 under Tariq bin Ziyad and all, and then they established a state, and the history goes on. And after about 3 centuries, 300 years of Muslim rule, Spain was actually fractured between Muslim administration and Christian administration. Half of Spain actually came under Christian control back. Now there was a city called Toledo. If you look at the Spanish map now, it is located almost at the center of Spain. This city was conquered by Christians in 1095, I think, by Alfonso VI. He was a Christian king, and the whole knowledge of the Muslims which they had been compiling in Spain and all the other places like Baghdad, Damascus and Cairo, the whole knowledge, they had immediately access to that knowledge. There is a very famous term called convivencia in Spanish. It means living together or working together. What this actually meant was that Christians, Jews or Muslims jo the, they were actually making copies of the books of the Greek philosophies and Roman philosophies and translating them into Arabic, into Latin and into any other language that the population needed. Now, much of the initial, if you read about the typical political history of or social history of Europe, you will actually, in European sources or Western sources, you would find that Renaissance, it started from like Greeks, and after a gap of like dark ages for like 1500 years, 1000 years, immediately interest developed in the antiquate knowledge, in the knowledge of the Greeks. This is actually a sham. What actually happened was that it was the Muslims' preservation of the knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans which sparked interest of the Europeans into those antiquities. And one of the examples that is given is a man who was called John Scott. He was a Britisher. He was basically a Scottish. He came from Scotland to Toledo to study Arabic and to study Muslim arts and knowledge. And he was actually involved in one of the schools of these translations in Conviventia. And after a while, after spending like 15 years, he went back to England and presented his findings to a group of priests, church clergymen. And along with them, he founded one of the very institutions that became the backbone of the European civilization to come. He actually founded around a small town an institution of learning which was later called as the University of Oxford. So he was actually one of the guys who was actually you can say he was actually the brains behind the idea. But what inspired him to actually found a institution of learning was actually the Muslim Spain Convivencia. He saw the tolerance that was being practiced over there and saw the kind of ideas that Muslims were researching on, that they would debate with each other and consider worthwhile to discuss. And so he founded the University of Oxford along with some other priests in 1000. The point that I am trying to establish here is that Muslim Spain had a big role in reviving the interest of the ancient knowledge of the Greeks and Romans in the Europeans. The third point that I would explain was actually the Mongols. Now we all have heard and read about the destruction caused by the Mongols to the Islamic civilization, but one of the very, you can say, destructive thing that they did was to burn the accumulated knowledge that the Muslims had gathered over the centuries in a matter of probably a decade when they took Baghdad in 1268. So this was actually one of the major reasons which hindered the progress of the Islamic civilization towards more progressive ideas. And the last point that was actually one of the reasons for the development of enlightenment, for the age of enlightenment and Renaissance, was the discovery of America, USA, by Christopher Columbus. Now I'll explain why. Because I think we all should understand that let me phrase it like this, that the age of enlightenment, the Western civilization, the claim that the Western civilization had to their superiority came from their religion initially. Later on it came from their technology, that because we are technologically superior, hence we have a God-given duty to civilize the rest of mankind and to spread our ideas towards the nations of Africa, Latin America and Asian countries. Now big science and big technology requires a lot of money. What happened by the discovery of USA was that the influx of global trade shifted from the Middle East and Far East towards the Atlantic Ocean, and England became the center of that Atlantic trade, which enabled England, France and other Western European powers to actually sponsor big science, and by sponsoring big science they could get more advanced technology and more advanced ideas. Now all of these factors, this was the first part of my presentation. All of these factors were actually responsible for the Renaissance or for the advent of enlightenment in Western Europe. Now how come this enlightenment actually triggered into the African nations and the Asian nations or the rest of the world was through the colonialism project. Through the colonialism project, much of the, how do you say it, much of the history and achievements of the other civilizations was actually undermined in order to pursue your political and economic agenda. Now one of the participants questioned, Ahmad, how is enlightenment related to colonialism? Well, in my opinion, the most simplest answer is enlightenment was the baggage that the Western civilization wanted to drop, and colonialism was the vehicle through which it was dropped into the rest of the world. It was actually the vehicle, because हम सारों को पता है European civilization, the genesis of the European civilization, its growth was entirely different from the Islamic civilization. In Europe, they had a big struggle with the church being controlling everything and all the things. So people were really fed up of the clergy. While Muslims, they actually didn't found any differences between science and their religion. They were scientists and they were religious as well. They found them to be compatible with each other. So one of the things that colonialism actually did was that it actually infused the idea that religion or spirituality is not compatible with the worldly life or with the worldly achievements. And this idea itself was actually inspired by the philosophies of the Muslim thinkers. I'll give you an example. Ibn Rushd, who is known by the Latinized name of Averroes, was one of the greatest thinkers of Muslim history and also is revered by Western civilization as well. Thomas Aquinas, the famous Italian theologian, who first proposed that there should be a distinction or bifurcation between religion and state, actually used the writings of Ibn Rushd to justify his reasoning. And because of his contribution, because of Ibn Rushd's writings contribution, he was actually revered as one of the greatest thinkers of Western Europe, even though he was an Arabic and of Muslim origin. And to further emphasize this point, Raphael, the famous Italian painter, in one of his famous paintings about European thinkers of Renaissance, he actually painted Ibn Rushd alongside Aristotle and Plato to actually thank Aristotle and the Muslim world for the debt that Europe had because of his thinking. So the point that I am trying to establish here is that colonialism was the vehicle through which enlightenment was brought into the Muslim world and to the other countries, and this had a terrible consequence. The result of this was terrible. Why? Because as I already established, the genesis or the struggle of the European civilization was actually different from Islam. They had a terrible struggle with the clergy, while Muslims, they didn't had any sizable skirmishes with the religion or with the religious authorities. So this had a terrible consequence. Now coming to another step, Mr. Rizwan, in one of the lectures that he delivered, he said something profound and fascinating that I really found fascinating. He said that printing press converted Islam into a Protestant religion. Now this really struck with me. What he meant was, what he wanted to say कि इस्लाम जो है प्रिंटिंग प्रेस की वजह से एक प्रोटेस्टेंट रिलीजन बन गया. He was referring to some English author, Francis Bacon, I think. And what he meant by this statement, that because of printing press, every individual in Muslim world had access to the holy book, the Quran, and they decided that they would read the Quran and interpret it the way they like it or the way they understood it. So they didn't require any higher authority or any learned clergyman to tell them what is written in the Quran or what does it mean. And he was actually saying that this had a very powerful impact on the Muslim world, on the way the enlightenment took place. I found another dimension to this thing. Let me reiterate that dimension. While I was researching, and I didn't research very much, I have to be honest here, I found that the first copy of the Quran that was printed in the world, the first printed copy of the Quran that was made anywhere in the world, was in actually the city of Venice in Italy in 15th century. And it was recently discovered in 1990s by a university professor, Angela Novovo, and that was actually the first printed copy of the Quran in Arabic. And according to historians and the experts of the matter, they said that this book wasn't actually a very popular notion that took place in Islamic world. People didn't bought this printed copy of the Quran. They were more used to the handwritten copies of the Quran. And I think this speaks volumes about the way that technology had a tremendous impact on the way Islamic civilization couldn't cope with the onslaught of the coming modernity that was about to come from colonialism. Why? Because printing press was actually one of the pioneer technologies that would have enabled mass distribution of ideas, knowledge, books into different parts of the world, into different parts of the Islamic civilization. By rejecting this technology, the printing press, Muslims actually hindered their progress towards new ideas, new innovations and new technology. And this is fascinating that the printed book was actually, the first copy of the Quran was printed in Venice, not in some Islamic city, even though Muslims at that time were at the height of their power in 14th, 15th century. They weren't that downwards as they are now. So this spoke volumes. If they would have adopted the printing press, in my opinion, this would have meant that they would have been able to exchange or debate new ideas, new ways to interpret religion, about how to reconcile it with the oncoming time of 15, 16, 17 generations. But because they rejected this idea of printing press, there were a lot of reasons why they rejected, but they rejected this idea of printing press. And this actually enabled Western civilization to advance much more quicker than Islamic civilization. This, I think, was one of the greatest reasons why enlightenment, when enlightenment through colonialism project came to the Asian countries and African countries and Islamic civilization, the Muslims weren't prepared to actually counter it on an intellectual, political, social or economic level. So this, I think, was one of the big reasons that Muslims are backward even today. Coming to the third portion of my presentation about what is the current situation and how to go forward. Enlightenment or modernity, as we can say it, or Renaissance, I am using these words interchangeably just for the sake of an amateur viewer, had such a long lasting impact on Islamic civilization that everything from the political, social, economic, even the way people behave, they live, they think, is inspired or is under the influence of the Renaissance and Enlightenment modernity. Considering the rich tradition of Islam का बड़ा rich tradition था, and Muslims were the pioneers of knowledge, and the examples that I have given of Thomas Aquinas and Ibn Rushd, the point that I wanted to mention, that even modernity has its roots from the Islamic civilization. So I think Muslims don't actually need modernity to actually interpret Islam for them. They should revisit, as Islam says, Islam में तजदीद और मुजद्दिद का concept है, about consensus है, इज्मा है, क़यास है, analogy. Muslims should revisit these tools and come up with their own original interpretation of how Islam is and can be a force which is compatible with the modern world. That is actually what I think should be the aim of every Muslim. What is actually happening these days is that many of these, in my opinion, many of these reformatory movements that we see in Muslim world today, in Western countries by Muslims, or in Muslim countries by Muslim thinkers and Muslim reformers, at their root, at their basic level, they are actually trying to shape Muslim civilization the way modern Western civilization shaped itself 500 years back. This is actually wrong, I think. They should come up with a brand new, with a very original genesis of how they want to interpret Islam and how Islam is compatible with the modern Muslim world. That is all, I think. Thank you. Any questions?